Good evening, all. Thank you for joining me as we take a look this evening at Maserati's first post-war model and race car, the A6. Maserati as a manufacturer was born out of the passion of a quartet of brothers, perhaps unsurprisingly, Maserati brothers, Alfieri, Bindo, Ettore, and Ernesto. Born to a railway worker, they started building and racing cars under their own name in the 1920s, after Alfieri, Bindo, and Ernesto's employer, the storied coach builder Diatto, closed down their racing division, and the brothers struck out on their own. They found near immediate success with their Tipo 26, itself built to the last of their Diatto designs, with a class victory and 9th overall at the Targa Florio in 1926. You see why they called it the Tipo 26. The company was always more racing-focused than profit-focused, and after Alfieri passed in 1932 following complications from a racing crash a few years earlier, the other brothers kept the firm going for several more years before selling their ownership stake to Adolfo Orsi in 1937, as the firm's finances were rather poorly. Nevertheless, the brothers were retained for an additional decade as consultants, designers, and engineers, and the firm continued to field racing cars with success in the interwar period. These entries included back-to-back wins at the Indy 500 in 1939 and 1940, remaining to this day the only Italian manufacturer to win the race. In fact, Ford's unwillingness to allow Ferrari to run cars at Indy under his own nameplate was reportedly one of the main sticking points that collapsed their acquisition negotiations and kicked off the Ford versus Ferrari war about 20 years subsequent. But back in 1940, of course, the second big global kerfuffle came along, and everyone stopped racing to shoot at each other for a few years, after which most of the European economies were in tatters, and all the auto manufacturers took a few years to pivot back to making automobiles. For more details on post-war reconstruction, my recent History of Racing Part 1 video is for you. However, the Italian auto manufacturers, and indeed Italy on the whole, got back in the motorsport swing of things more quickly than the rest of the continent, and thus peacetime industry had started to rebuild earlier than in Germany or France. The brothers Maserati departed from the firm in 1947, with their final contribution to their eponymous company coming in the form of a new straight-six engine and the company's debut road car. With the road car taking the engine's name, they were both dubbed the A6, A in honor of the late Alfieri. The Alfieri that passed in 1932 was the second of two Alfieri Maseratis born in the family. The first Alfieri had died about age 1, and the name had been used again upon Alfieri II's birth. And 6 for the engine's cylinder count. Originally a 1.5-liter engine in the road car, the design for both was started back in 1941, but obviously delayed until the latter part of the decade. Thus, the car didn't start production until 1947, with the road-going prototype debuting at the Geneva Auto Show in March that year, and the first competition version hitting the proverbial track, open road, at that year's Mille, although it failed to finish. The road car was bodied by Pininfarina, an elegant, if somewhat modest, Berlinetta that was later rebodied into a 2+2 fastback. Power was an unremarkable 65 horsepower from the straight 6, with a single overhead camshaft and initially 1, later 3 Weber carburetors. The chassis was a tube and sheet steel construction with double wishbone suspension at the front and a solid rear axle, and the 61 cars produced could hit about 150 kph, specifics depending on minor changes from year to year and body style to body style. The first competition model, nominally the 2000 Sport, but generally called the A6GCS, was decidedly pre-war in styling, but most things were in the immediate post-war environment, and with a larger 2-liter 130 horsepower version of the engine and lightweight aluminum bodywork from Fantuzzi, the car's performance was promising, with a quoted top speed of 190 kph or 118 miles an hour when mated to its 4-speed manual transmission. The car's name, apart from the A prefix, is purely a practical one. The G stands for the engine's cast iron block, and CS stands for Corsa Sport. There would also be a CM for Corsa Monoposto, but we don't really talk much about single-seat racing here. It sported a conventional ladder chassis supporting the engine, with numerous chassis components sourced from Gilco, who also provided structural members for Ferrari at the time. As with the road car, suspension was double wishbones and coils at the front, but a live axle and leaf springs at the rear, and all four wheels had hydraulic drum brakes. The car's first victory came in its debut year in September at Modena, where two cars were entered for Luigi Villoresi and Alberto Ascari, with Ascari taking the race win followed by Villoresi, 17 seconds behind, ahead of several Alfa Romeos and early Ferrari models, as well as a 1.5-liter A6 and a BMW 328. The following year, Giovanni Bracco would win the National Italian Racing Championship with an A6 as well, and 15 cars made it off the line between 1947 and 53. The car was essentially an ongoing prototype program, with each new chassis integrating learnings from prior builds and their competition outings, with an alloy cylinder head, a rather early addition, and the final builds incorporating dry-sump lubrication, and a twin-cam engine for the very last car, borrowed from improvements implemented for the Formula 2 CM model under the guidance of one Giacchino Colombo, poached from Alfa Romeo after he had previously departed from Ferrari after designing arguably their most enduring V12, which bore his name and would power pretty much every V12-powered road-going or endurance Ferrari for decades. So, not a credentialed individual or anything. In 1953, however, Maserati's desire to compete with the best in the newly created World Sports Car Championship necessitated additional changes to bring the A6 into compliance with international regulations, which by now required wheels to be fully integrated into the bodywork, amongst a raft of other, less visually obvious rules. Thus, we received the A6GCS/53, or, if you prefer, A6, the next generation. Really upping the styling game, mostly with Spider-style bodies from Fantuzzi, although there were several Berlinettas built by Pininfarina as well, the new 53 model sported the improved engine from the last of the original A6's competition run, good for 170 horsepower and a higher top speed, estimated at 145 miles an hour or 233 kph, with that power still headed to the rear wheels through a 4-speed manual gearbox with synchros on the 3rd and 4th gears. Bodywork remained aluminum, not that there were many other choices at the time, steel. Drum brakes continued to provide the stopping power, and so on. This car, too, proved almost immediately competitive, running 1-2 in class at their debut in the 1953 Miglia, with Emilio Giletti and Garino Bertocchi ahead of Sergio Mantovani.
Mantovani? They play Mantovani to insomniacs who don't respond to strong drugs.
And an R. Palazzi. The two drivers, Mantovani and the other one, the teleprompter is going too quickly, had a similar result in the Targa Florio, while Fangio himself was also on the driver's list for the second-placed Mantovani car that year, but I'm not 100% clear on whether or not he actually drove in the race. Wins either in class or outright also came that year at Caserta, another 1-2 for Mantovani and Luigi Musso at the Giro dell'Umbria, del Calabria, the Coppa d'Oro, and at Avellino for Musso. Mostly national-level competitions, to be fair, but still, they were going up against Ferrari 250s, Lancias, and Alfa Romeos, sometimes piloted by many of the great names of the era, so still good results. These successes also brought demand for the car, and while the original A6GCS sold 15 cars over its 7-year production run, the updated World Sports Car Championship eligible car saw more than 50 built and sold in only 3 years, from 1953 to 55. The car's best results usually came from what might be considered their home races in Italy. To be fair, there were more of them entered in those, so quantity has a quality all its own, but 1954 saw a 2nd and 3rd place in class, 3rd and 4th overall, behind Marzotto's Ferrari in the Mille, class victories at the Giro di Sicilia, the Spa Grand Prix, that's admittedly in Belgium, not Italy, and the Targa Florio, but they were DNF at Le Mans, and the only World Sports Car Championship victory for the car that year came at the RAC Tourist Trophy, 5th overall behind larger-engined Lancias, a Ferrari, and a Jag. 1955 was the car's final year in major international competition, with the 200S and 300S slowly superseding it as Maserati's top sports racing model, but it started out its Sunset Tour in style, with a class victory and overall podium at the 1,000 kilometers of Buenos Aires, followed by a Class 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the Mille, and closing the season with a repeat class victory at the RACTT and another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the Targa Florio. They did continue to see entries in private hands for a few years, but with diminishing success as new models came in and interest grew in the new World Sports Car Championship. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, those A6s that have survived are inordinately valuable, easily seeing prices at auction well into the seven-figure range, with the later cars generally commanding a significant premium over earlier production. Photos for this video mostly came from last year's Le Mans Classic, with a few pulled from Pinterest, Reddit, and Facebook. Other cars or topics mentioned in this video that have already been covered on the channel include the general history of sports car racing up to 1953, including both post-war reconstruction and the rule changes that necessitated the development of the 1953 A6, the BMW 328, the 1953 Miglia, and I think that's it. I know I've covered one of the alphas, whether it's the 6C or 8C, I can't remember off the top of my head, and that was tangentially mentioned. Anyway, links to those videos in the description if I remember to put them there. If I didn't, comment and I'll update it. You can also find them through that very helpful search bar at the top of your screen if you're of the DIY mindset. And one more piece of general channel admin, probably not going to have a Friday video next week in its normal style, as I'll be at Daytona Historics, but I will be publishing an entry list analysis similar to last year's Sebring edition, probably next Wednesday, and then we'll see if I've got enough juice left over and time left over for a Friday video. Perhaps another re-record. Or, if anyone wants to request a video about a relative footnote in automotive history that I'm unlikely to ever be able to get photos of, I'll consider those as well. Anyway, for this week's call to action not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube,
like, comment, subscribe.
This past Monday, October 21st, was Trafalgar Day, and today is actually the 609th anniversary of the Battle of Agincourt, the 170th anniversary of the Charge of the Light Brigade, the 80th of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and the 62nd of the midpoint of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was actually in Dallas over the past weekend and saw the very spot where Kennedy died, and I guess what I'm kind of getting at is that it's all too easy to become oblivious to the richness of the past and the inarguably incredible series of events that have slowly but surely brought us to the present. And while great battles and headline-making events are the easiest parts of that series to commemorate because they have the decency to take place on specific dates and be far better documented than the average Tuesday, well, to slightly paraphrase the great Charles Darwin, there is grandeur in this view of life. From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. So, take the time to reflect a little bit over the next few days. As always, thank you for your time this evening or whenever and wherever you are watching, and I wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.